Okay, good afternoon, everybody. You're very welcome to today's 30-minute briefing. President Trump and his administration are dominating the news cycle since they came to power 50 days ago. The objective of this briefing is very much to focus on food and agribusiness. Tariffs of 25% on EU exports to the States are mooted. We export close to 2 billion euros worth of food and drink, so this change in environment is a real cause of concern for everybody in the agri-food value chain, from primary producer to farmer, all the way through to the exporter. To help us understand what is happening in Washington, DC, we're delighted to be joined by Bryan Kuehl. Bryan is a leading food and agribusiness lobbyist based in Washington, DC. He has extensive experience advising businesses on US trade policy, tariffs, and market access. He's a principal at Pinion, and Pinion is ifac's partner firm in the States, very similar to us in terms of a very strong focus on farming, food, and agribusiness. Now, Bryan is going to provide us with a real insider's perspective on how the new Trump administration's trade policies can impact on Irish agri-food businesses. We're also delighted to be joined by my own colleague, Carl Kassan, who heads up our Public Policy and Economics Department. And Carl, I'm going to start with you. Will you set the scene briefly in terms of the extent of Irish exports to the USA, who is exporting, and who will these potential tariffs impact?
Thanks very much, David, and it's great to be able to join yourself and Bryan this afternoon. As you mentioned already, about 2 billion of food and agri exports go into America each year from Ireland, which is a large percentage out of our overall circa 17 billion that we export. Now, very quickly looking at what the split is there, for some people mightn't realize this, the actual biggest sector actually is our drink sector. So our whiskies and our cream liqueurs, etc. like that, they export about 860 million into the States. That's followed on then by dairy with about 750 million, which, if you think about it, is probably in the main made up with the likes of Kerrygold butter and other butter products, but also we'll have some ingredients to go into different products as it goes into the States. If you flip it over and look at it from the other side then, because when we're talking about this and when we're dealing with these kind of questions, the big thing for President Trump is the balance of trade and that. So we're exporting about 2 billion, but on the other side of the coin, we're importing maybe between about 700 to 800 million is what's coming in from the States. Now, this is probably mainly driven by the likes of soya for animal feed, but also a substantial enough amount, say, on the likes of nuts, your almonds, your pistachios and stuff like that, which are high value crops coming out of the US. If you just look on a little bit further beyond, say, the pure kind of agri-food, we must also, I would say, consider, say, farm machinery and what's going on there and the broader kind of agricultural sector for exports and imports. So looking very quickly at that sector, the US exports about 8 billion worth of farm machinery each year and imports about 11 billion. And then looking at the EU at a total, the EU exports about 40 billion and imports about 30 billion. So again, there's probably a balance of trade in favor of the EU there, which would be a concern maybe for that sector with the way President Trump is looking at things. So that's a very, very quick overview, David, of roughly what the trade looks like between Ireland, the EU and the States and where the balance of trade is currently sitting.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Bryan, you're very, very welcome. You're well acquainted with Ireland. Your father-in-law was actually the ambassador to Ireland during the presidency of Bill Clinton, so they were simpler times in some way. Bryan, give us a sense of your work in Washington. You know, what are you involved in?
Well, first, let me start by thanking you and your full team, David and Carol. Very much appreciate the opportunity to be here and very much welcome the partnership between both our companies and our countries. So yes, as you said in the introduction, I'm based in the United States. I spend most of my time in Washington, DC, and I work on agriculture trade issues. I'm a partner in Pinion, and I'm Director of Government and Public Affairs. But I also serve as Executive Director of Farmers for Free Trade, which is a US-based advocacy organization that talks about trade and advocates for trade that supports US agriculture. So I live and breathe this subject matter. Farmers for Free Trade last year helped launch the Congressional Agriculture Trade Caucus, which is a bipartisan congressional caucus in the US House of Representatives. So we work very closely with Congress, with the White House, and of course out in the States, we work with producers and food processors around the US.
Okay. So the reason you're on this call is really to give us some insight into how you see the Trump administration dealing with Europe and by extension Ireland from an agri-food perspective. So set the scene from Capitol Hill. What's the perspective around agri-food at the moment with the new Trump administration?
Sure. Well, and thank you for that question, David. I think in order to understand the current moment that we find ourselves in, you really have to take a step back and look at where we've been. And for that, I think you need to look first at Trump 1.0, the first Trump administration, and understand what happened there. In Trump 1.0, President Trump launched trade wars with multiple countries. He started, for all practical purposes, with steel and aluminum using what's called Section 232 of U.S. trade law to say that we needed to build, for national security reasons, we needed to build our domestic steel and aluminum industries. So he launched steel and aluminum tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum from around the world. That led to a short-term trade disruption with the EU, but that was quickly rolled back. At the time, President Trump and the president of the EU reached an agreement where the EU, in theory, would increase LNG imports and increase soybean imports, and in return, the tariffs would be stood off for a little while. Ultimately, President Biden negotiated a more comprehensive deal with the EU on steel and aluminum, which included some tariff rate quotas, and that allowed that trade dispute to resolve. That's important context to know because literally tomorrow, March 12th, we're expecting that trade dispute to resume with new tariffs coming in that the U.S. will place on all countries with steel and aluminum. So this is a very timely webinar. The other thing to know, in addition to steel and aluminum tariffs, as we look at global trade conflicts and potential flashpoints, is that President Trump has also talked about what he calls reciprocal tariffs. And those are tariffs to try to adjust imbalances in trade, primarily trade in goods. He's not focused so much on trade in services. And that those tariffs, in theory, would take effect on April 2nd. So we have sort of two waves coming at us, steel and aluminum tariffs as a flashpoint tomorrow, and then reciprocal tariffs potentially April 2nd.
Okay, that April 2nd date, how do you think that impacts on Trump's priorities around agricultural imports into the States? Is it going to be a big flashpoint?
I think it could be, and I think even the steel and aluminum tariffs tomorrow, even though ostensibly they're not on agricultural imports, they could also become a flashpoint in the same sense. A couple of things you need to understand. Number one, the United States is chewing off trade wars with adversaries and allies alike around the world. So we've talked about steel and aluminum, we've talked about reciprocal tariffs. This is in the context where the U.S. has had on again, off again tariffs over the last 2 months with Mexico and Canada, two of our largest trading partners, where the U.S. has put 20% tariffs on all inbound goods from China. So the U.S. is clearly in a posture of wanting to pick fights around trade issues. That has an immediate impact of affecting U.S. agriculture. One of our largest exports is agriculture, 16 billion in soybean exports to China last year, 7 billion in corn exports to Mexico. So U.S. ag is heavily dependent on exports. So as we have trade wars and U.S. ag gets squeezed, I think President Trump will be looking for ways to help agriculture, U.S. agriculture. And that in turn will lead to pressure on the EU to accept more agricultural exports from the U.S. I think that will include specifically dairy as a place where there's a fairly big imbalance between the EU and U.S.
Okay, we'll touch on dairy in a second. I know you're in your Wyoming office today. The farmers around Wyoming, for example, who you'll be very familiar with, what's their perspective on how Trump is dealing with farming and agri-food? Has it evolved, or what are they thinking?
I would say it's mixed. Farmers supported President Trump in the last election by about a 2-to-1 margin, so very strong base of support for President Trump. And I would say most in the ag community are willing to give President Trump some leeway to try to prosecute his vision of trade. But having said that, I think a lot of farmers are also nervous about the disruption that's coming, and recognize that the 2018-2019 trade wars cost U.S. agriculture about $27 billion. So these are not small dollar numbers we're talking about, and the disruption can be very massive.
Carl, we're going to just touch off dairying for a second, and obviously the Kerrygold brand going into the States is a massive part of the Irish agri-food export to the States. So maybe just talk about dairying for a minute, and we'll just get Bryan to, share how he sees dairy imports changing over the coming short period, because that impacts a lot of our clients, a lot of farmers, and a lot of the companies we work with.
Yeah, so as I mentioned there at the start, we're probably looking about 750 million, which is tiny when you think of the US as a total, but for, say, Irish dairy, it's a huge part, because when you look at the tonnage, it's not ginormous, but it is high value, like, as we say, Kerrygold butter. So I'm not sure if you're aware, Bryan, but Kerrygold butter is actually the #2 seller in the US, #1 imported butter. So it has a significant part in the market. So you'd be hoping from an Irish perspective that it's price inelastic for tariffs being applied to it, but 20-25% tariff on top of butter is a big risk from our perspective. And can I just actually ask you one thing there, Bryan, because you just mentioned there about, we'll say Trump won and the effect it had on, say, US farmers and ranchers. And I know back in, was it 18 or 19, there had to be emergency relief payments that were probably to the tune of 20-30 billion that were issued to farmers. If something similar happens this time, let's say, and as you say, there is that large trade with soya, with the likes of China, even Europe, with Mexico, is there the possibilities that such payments will be made to farmers again, or will the kind of, let's say, the new regime in the US, where we've got Doge and Elon Musk trying to cut government spending, trying to make government smaller, would such a scheme to help US farmers be still on the table if they really are significantly affected in trade wars over the next, say, year to 18 months?
Carol, that's a fantastic question and insightful. So President Trump and his new Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, have both indicated they would like to provide payments to farmers, like the 2018 program, which was called the Market Facilitation Program. The challenge is the U.S. the U.S. Fiscal deficit, the debt, and fiscal austerity measures that are being implemented, as you mentioned, by Musk, but also efforts on Capitol Hill to reduce spending. Last go round, the funding for the farmers came out of what's called the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is a fund that the U.S. Congress puts money into, and then the president can draw out of for crises, basically. That fund is largely depleted at this point. It only has about $5 billion in it right now, compared to, as you said, about $30 billion in payments last go round. So Congress would have to replenish that fund, and that's in the context of efforts to cut spending across the board. So it will not be easy. I think there will be efforts to make sure farmers get payments, but I think that the math is going to be very, very tricky.
Okay. You mentioned Brooke Rollins there. Tell us a little bit about her background and how she got to the position of being Secretary of Ag.
Sure. So Brooke Rollins was raised in Texas on a farm. Went to a university in Texas where she studied ag. So has background to that degree. She's not worked in agriculture most of her life. I think her strong suit is that she's very loyal to President Trump and has worked closely with him both in the White House during Trump version 1, and then off the Hill in a nonprofit that is very Trump focused between the two Trump presidencies. So I expect her very much to advocate for U.S. farmers, but at the same time, very much be an implementer for Trump policies.
Through your work with the different trade associations, have the trade associations had much exposure to Ms. Rollins at this stage?
They have. So I was at a large conference in the United States last week called Commodity Classic, which is the conference for soy, corn, wheat, and sorghum. And Brooke Rollins spoke to that group. And, she was very clear she wanted to help protect farmers from disruptions. That was one of her messages. but also acknowledge that there are efforts to, for example, cut back staffing at U.S. Department of Agriculture, to cut back U.S. food aid programs, which purchase about $2 billion of U.S. commodities every year. So I think she knows she's walking a knife's edge between wanting to help farmers, but also recognizing there are disruptions happening.
Okay. The FDA, the USDA, sustainability standards, do you see change in all that legislation around sustainability during this administration, and how might that impact on imports into the country?
This is a really fascinating topic, and I think there's a lot that's not known at this moment. So the United States, President Trump nominated and the Senate confirmed Robert Kennedy Jr. To be Secretary of Health and Human Services for the United States. As Secretary of HHS, he has jurisdiction over the Food and Drug Administration, so food safety issues. He is very clearly on the record as being skeptical of pesticides, skeptical of GMOs. So sort of rowing in the opposite direction where a lot of U.S. agriculture has gone, and rowing to some degree in the direction that EU agriculture has gone, more pesticide-free and more GMO-free. EU policy around pesticide and other sustainability standards has been a barrier to trade. I think that's been an irritant. So it will be really interesting to see if RFK Jr.'s policy positions begin to bleed over into the international trade space. Does the U.S. start to adopt a more pesticide skeptic approach? Does it begin to adopt more of a precautionary principle approach, which is how the EU evaluates risk? Those are all unknown questions, but I think it's one we're definitely watching.
Okay. For all our attendees, if you want to put in a question, just stick it into the Q&A and we'll ask Bryan or Carl any question that you have. Carl, your view on tariffs as an economist, do you like tariffs or do you not like tariffs?
I'd be more of a free trade advocate, I would think. But yeah. I guess with Bryan here, I might just throw the question to him and see his thoughts instead of me giving mine. But like, I mean, when we look at, say, the overall kind of, let's say, idea in Trump's head, President Trump, you can't disagree hugely with it that he's looking at a large trade imbalance, as you say, in products, not services. Over the last 30 years, huge amount of manufacturing jobs have left the US. So he's looking at a way to try and, say, bring these back into the US. But, I mean, the issues you'd be kind of saying is we're now in global supply chains. So, yeah, you move some manufacturing, say, of finished products back to the US, but chances are a lot of the components will be made in different countries. So unless you can bring everything back to the US, there's going to be tariffs on some part of the good that is manufactured in the US, thus making that more expensive to try and export to a third country out of the US, which is kind of defeating the purpose of trying to rebalance that trade. And even looking at the last time in 18, I think like there was movement, say, on the dollar where the dollar strengthened and the Chinese, say, devalued their yen and that kind of thing. Again, kind of negating what tariffs were doing. And I'm just, I suppose, back to you, Bryan, what's your thoughts on the overall kind of, let's say, overall plan? If we took out the short-term pains that maybe they're for US ag or even here for us in Europe and that kind of thing, do you think longer term what Trump is trying to do has merit, or it could work, or what are your overall thoughts, I would say?
Again, great question. You know, I think what does have overall merit is the big picture that Trump is trying to strive for, trying to make sure that the U.S. is treated fairly with its allies and adversaries alike, trying to rebalance and make sure that domestic manufacturing is healthy. I don't think many people in the United States would argue with those goals. I think one of the big unknowns is how much tariffs are a means to an end versus the end themselves. So, for example, as President Trump threatens tariffs on Canada, you know, he's now saying he wants to put 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada. Is that a negotiating posture? Is that really where we're going to end up? Or are the tariffs just the lever to try to get a rebalanced conversation? It makes sense to me that in the context of the EU in particular and the UK as well, that the US and those blocs need to have larger conversations on multiple issues. I mean, we're obviously talking Ukraine. we're talking defense spending, we're talking international trade, we're talking health standards or pesticide regulation. There's a whole slew of topics. And I think what I would encourage folks in the EU and the UK to think about is how do we address these issues globally with the US? How do we reach accords that boost both countries or both trading blocs' interests? For example, LNG exports. I think there's every incentive to increase exports of liquid natural gas from the United States to the EU and decrease, for example, from Russia. Those are points where there could be an accord, and you could see a lot of issues get resolved that may not, strictly speaking, be trade related.
In terms of your advice, Bryan, for the EU and for the Irish government, and indeed our own Taoiseach Micheál Martin is in the Oval Office tomorrow. If his advisors had reached out to you and said, Bryan, bit of advice here, going into the Oval Office, we're meeting President Trump tomorrow, what should we be saying to him and how should we be handling agri-food? And let's just keep a focus on agri-food here. So what would your advice have been should they have reached out to you?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, they did not reach out to me. But
next time, though, Bryan.
But I would have said for your Taoiseach, my advice would be to try to reach a deal, to try to find common ground with President Trump. You know, he views himself very much as a deal maker. He's very transactional. He, you know, had Ghost written for him the book, The Art of the Deal. So that's sort of his brand. So I think going in and speaking with a little bit of honey is probably the right approach. And in fact, you know, again, if you look back on the 2018 steel and aluminum dispute, the reason that did not become a bigger flashpoint with the EU is because the EU very quickly moved to try to find some accord in terms of soybean purchases or LNG purchases. So I would think try to find ways to work together, and that will probably be the best outcome.
Okay, Bryan, there's some really good questions coming in here from one of our agribusiness journalists, Lachlan Roach Kelly in the Farmers Journal. He's just asking the question, the extreme policy uncertainty risks making the US a country that becomes very difficult to deal with at all. Comment. It was a longer comment that Larkin made, but that's the crux of it. Is the US becoming a country that it's becoming very difficult to deal with?
I think that is a concern. And speaking just for myself or Farmers for Free Trade, I think one of our concerns, for example, is if you look at 2019, we negotiated with Canada and Mexico the US-Canada-Mexico agreement, a large free trade agreement. And now we're back into a spat about tariffs and about how they're treating us on dairy. And I think that's difficult to reconcile because we have a trade agreement, we've signed on the dotted line, we've shaken hands. Why are we now in a dispute again? And I think the U.S. needs to be careful that you can only have so many bites at the apple before people stop wanting to work with you. The U.S. obviously is the largest economy in the world. It's got its own heft. People are always going to orient toward the U.S. as a purchaser of goods, but I think that uncertainty is dangerous, and I would hope that the U.S. will move to resolve some of this uncertainty very soon. I think markets are reflecting that concern about the level of uncertainty right now.
Okay. How will U.S. companies and the U.S. administration react to EU requirements for more sustainability reporting, such as CSRD, which require things like carbon reporting? So CSRD, big legislation, a lot of effort being put into it among European companies. How do you think that's going to change in the Trump administration?
Well, I think a lot turns on how these things are implemented. I mean, interestingly, the Trump administration or some people in the Trump administration have toyed with the idea of a carbon tax, largely as a way of squeezing China, I believe, but not dissimilar to the border adjustment mechanism that the EU has looked at. My advice to U.S. agriculture is always lean in on the sustainability conversation. And the reason I think we should lean in is because the U.S. actually is U.S. ag is actually very sustainable. Pesticide use is very low. Fertilizer use is very low compared to other countries, in part because the U.S. is able to produce at such scale. So we don't have small farms, we have very large farms, which leads to efficiency. So I think a lot turns on how the EU defines sustainability and how they implement things like minimum residue levels for pesticides, whether they entirely ban certain pesticides that the U.S. likes to use. that is one approach. I think the approach that the US would like to take is one of sustainable intensification, saying, let's focus on the actual impacts on the ground. And there, I think if you go pound for pound, or if you look at biodiversity impacts, the US feels like it can stand up against most ag, certainly against Brazilian ag, where you have rainforest and deforestation issues. But I think around the world, the US feels very proud of its track record on sustainability.
Okay. In Trump 1.0, the Boeing dispute was already in play between the EU and the US, and the tariffs imposed were predicated on the pre-existing trade dispute. On this occasion, Trump 2.0, do you see the potential for an entirely new baseline for tariffs? Or is it possible that the original Boeing dispute suspension would simply be lifted and the same penalty levels applied? That's from a very knowledgeable senior executive who worked in the States for an Irish company.
So I would say yes, and I would think that the place where the EU starts is with lifting and reinstating the original tranche of tariffs. But I think a trade war between steel and aluminum and reciprocal tariffs could easily get much bigger than the last go round. So I think I would expect that there would be retaliation much larger that could expand. And then, of course, the EU has also talked about their anti-coercion instrument, the ACI, as another deterrence measure. So I think worst case scenario, things could spin out of control. We could see deterioration in relationships, and we could see a tit for tat escalation of trade measures and countermeasures.
And a final question coming from Scotland. Do you hear concern in Washington for ensuring global food security alongside balanced trade and fairness for the US? Are you hearing anything like that, Bryan, or is that part of the conversation?
It's a great question, and it's in the context of one of the first things the Trump administration did when they came into office was to hollow out U.S. Agency for International Development, and it's roughly $2 billion of food exports every year. I expect that will be reestablished, maybe moved over to U.S. Department of Agriculture as opposed to being in USAID. I expect it will be less because the Trump administration is concerned about food security and more because they're concerned about domestic interests and exports. That I think there will be significant pressure for purchasing food as part of a food aid plan. Of course, food aid is critically important both as a moral issue, helping food insecure areas and nutrition insecure areas, and also as a geopolitical issue for soft power into Africa versus China. So I don't think the final chapter on that story has been written, and I would expect the U.S. will very much be in the food aid business before too long.
Okay, we're coming close to the end of this installment of the webinar series. Just give us a little bit of color, Bryan, from Washington. You're knocking around Washington maybe 20 years. You've seen a couple of administrations come and go. How different is it at the moment, or is it different indeed?
Oh, I'd say it's pretty radically different. I would say the level of disruption is more than I've seen in the 20 plus years that I've been in this business. And the level of disruption is coming on more fronts and at a faster pace than I've seen. So disruptions in terms of cuts to U.S. government staffing, disruption in terms of the trade wars, certainly increasing concerns about mass deportations and how they could hit different ag sectors. So I think there's a lot of disruption happening, and I think it's moving very fast. I mean, you noted in your lead up to this webinar that we're looking at the 50th day of the Trump administration. It's not 2 months, and the level of change and the rate of change is really astounding. And I do not know what things will look like a year from now, but I expect that the pace of change is not going to slow down. I expect that we're going to see acceleration, if anything.
Okay, Carl, some final comments?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose thinking about it and what you kind of outlined there, Bryan, is that like looking at President Trump from a distance to this side of the Atlantic, let's say and you referenced the book, like it's all about the act of the deal, like so we have all this, how would I say, friction at the moment and these huge tariffs being placed on different countries and being removed, being put back on again, and the uncertainty is a bit crazy. But I mean, the hope would be, yeah, I agree with you that, like, let's say something is probably going to boil up to the surface between the EU and the US very, very shortly. But hopefully some bit of sanity can be brought to the discussion, and that some deal can be done that kind of can get some bit of certainty back in. Because I mean, yeah, we're advisors, we're getting questions about what may happen, but like, I'd hate to be in the seat, say, of senior executives or CEOs at the moment that are trying to do business in any way related with the US or that are affected from the tariffs. So I'd be hoping next time we speak, we might have a bit more clarity and a bit more certainty, because we see, even like, I mean, I know you can't be looking at the stock markets, but I mean, they're just all over the shop at the moment. So hopefully things calm down fairly shortly.
I would wholeheartedly agree, and I would also, to end on a positive note, I would just remind everyone of the deep and long-standing relationship both between the U.S. and the EU, but the U.S. and Ireland in particular. I think Americans feel a special kinship with Ireland, a literal kinship in terms of the diaspora and the number of folks who came to the U.S. and the number of people in the U.S. who consider themselves of Irish heritage. So I think at the end of the day, while there may be spats like in any family, I suspect they will resolve, and relations ultimately will be very strong.
Okay, Bryan, thanks very much. We're going to keep a close eye on tomorrow and how our Taoiseach gets on with President Trump tomorrow. We'll keep a close eye on April 2nd. We'll continue to work with some of our clients with the Pinion team in the States as we try to navigate through these issues. Thanks everyone for joining today. And I expect, Bryan, we'll be running another ifac Pinion Washington briefing in the not too distant future. So look, enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Carol.
Thanks very much.